Last time we spoke, Rear Admiral Seymour took the charge as he waged war on the city of Canton to hunt down the seemingly tyrannical Yuming Chen. Seymour took the city quickly and with ease, but he knew he had no way to hold onto it, so he opted to start capturing all the forts along the riverways. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the politicians were raging over the entire conflict and what was the best course of action. The Tories and Whigs fought another to use the issue for their own interests, and it seems the Tories might be successful at thwarting the need for another war with China. But not if the Whigs had anything to say about it. Now a new figure will come to the forefront to be placed in charge of the China issue, and it will consume his life. This episode is part 2 of the Second Opium War, Lord Elgin's Reluctant War. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I happen to have an entire episode on the Second Opium War. Give it a look, it means a lot to me. Now, outside Parliament, the British public was in a jingoistic mood after winning the Crimean War. Palmerston began to appeal to the masses on the basis of patriotism. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister decided to appoint a plenipotentiary to carry out negotiations with the Qing court. The Duke of Newcastle was Palmerston's first choice, but he rejected the job as he knew it would be a thankless one and would earn him no favors. On March the 13th, in the middle of a general election, Palmerston announced a new appointment for the new envoy to China. It was the popular Scotsman, former governor of Jamaica and British North America, James Bruce, the Earl of Elgin, a direct descendant of Robert the Bruce. Lord Elgin was the son of a famous antiquarian who had notoriously preserved, or better said, vandalized, if you're Greek that is, parts of ancient Athens by shipping them back to Britain. Yes, the British Museum issue that we hear about a lot today. Elgin Sr. also sold these pieces of history in question to the British Museum at around £35,000 in 1816 before going bankrupt and leaving England in exile to escape his creditors. So yeah, Daddy was not a good person, so to say. Ironically, Elgin's father's actions would haunt him in this story, because he would perform a heinous act on a similar level. During the 3-day voting period that began on March the 28th of 1857, the Whigs managed to return to office with a landslide victory. Turns out Palmerston had won the public over, alongside the Queen and now Parliament. The day before Palmerston named Elgin the plenipotentiary to China, Elgin wrote to his wife, "My dearest, I have had a note from Palmerston, followed by an interview. The proposal is to undertake a special mission of a few months' duration to settle the important and difficult question now embarrassing us in the East, and concentrating the attention of all the world. On what grounds can I decline? Not on political grounds, for however opposed I might be to the government, that would be a reason to prevent them from making the offer, but not me from accepting it. The very mission of the plenipotentiary is an admission that there are errors of policy to be repaired." Elgin's wife responded with this: "Dearest, it was unexpected, but if your conscience and feelings tell you to say yes, I would not for the world dissuade you. God bless you on your own, darling. I promise you to do my best not to distress you. Forgive me if I can't write more today. Your own ever, Mary. Now, Lord Elgin had a very impressive career. As I said, he had been the governor of Jamaica and the governor general of British North America. I live in Quebec, and he is quite the figure here. There is a statue of him in front of the Quebec Parliament building. Lord Elgin attempted to establish responsible government to Canada. He wrestled issues of immigration to Canada and took up a surprising stance during the French-English conflict. You see, there were rebellions in what was then called Upper and Lower Canada, over various colonial issues. Lord Elgin ended up compensating French Canadians who had suffered during the rebellion, and this greatly pissed off his British colleagues. On top of that, Elgin invited the leader of the Lower Canada Revolt, Papineau, to dine with him at the Governor-General's residence in Canada. This prompted an English mob to begin burning Parliament buildings in Montreal. Elgin was assaulted, but instead of calling in the military, Elgin got his family to safety and he allowed civil authorities to restore order. Anyways, Elgin did a lot in Canada, such as setting up economic treaties with the United States and such. He is a large figure in my country's history, though I honestly would argue not many Canadians are even aware of him. Canadian history can be, the best way to put it, a bit boring. Back to the story at hand, Lord Elgin was a very well-regarded figure for his capabilities and royal blood, but he also held a ton of debt coming from his father, the Greek artifact plunderer. Elgin was notably not xenophobic in a time when many British were. Elgin spoke English and French. He was a very highly educated man. The day before Elgin set off for China, he was given detailed instructions from Lord Clarendon. Clarendon ordered Elgin that under no circumstances was he to try and retake Canton. A tall order since Bowring and Seymour were literally trying to do just that. Clarendon stated that he was to acquire the right for Britain to send an ambassador to Beijing to conduct and direct negotiations with the Qing imperial court. He was to demand the opening of new ports of trade and to force the Qing government to adhere to the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing. Military force was only to be a last resort, if the emperor refused, and Elgin was urged to contain the military action to naval attacks only and to save British lives. Elgin had his own demand. He wanted the British military forces in China to be under his sole command. Britain ended up giving Elgin joint command alongside Lieutenant Generals Ashburnham and Seymour, who would decide when and where to attack. Elgin made record time journeying to China by riding on the brand new railroad that cut across the Isthmus of Suez. From Suez he took his ship, rounding the coast of India in late May. Elgin came across troops who had been summoned from Bombay and Calcutta. Interesting side note, in May, Sepoys, those being Indian troops in the East India Company Army, stationed in Meerut, performed a mutiny. They had refused to follow orders from their British officers, and on May the 10th, an entire garrison killed their officers, their families, and any Europeans in their vicinity. Word spread of the mutiny resulting in similar outbreaks amongst other Sepoy units. Within just a few days, there was a widespread rebellion as some Indian princes joined in, rallying against the British Raj. Northern India was ablaze with bloodshed, and it looked like Britain was at threat of losing its greatest colony. Elgin arrived in Singapore on June the 3rd, where he was met with 2 letters from Lord Canning, the Governor-General of India. The letters told Elgin the dire news and begged him to divert troops assigned to the China mission to come help out in India. Canning was an old classmate of Elgin and said, "If you send me troops, they shall not be kept 1 hour more than is absolutely necessary." Elgin had no time to consult with Palmerston or Clarendon, as it would take 2 months to get word back to London. But without hesitation, Elgin diverted 1,700 men of the 90th Regiment from Mauritius to help quell the rebellion. I obviously can't go into the Indian Rebellion of 1857 too much, but I just want to say, if you ever get a chance, do learn about it. It's an absolutely horrifying event. Around 150,000 Indians were killed in this rebellion, with 100,000 of them being civilians. The British suffered around 6,000 troops and 40,000 civilians were killed. The British forces performed massacres and numerous atrocities in places like Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and Allahabad. On top of the war deaths, it is estimated up to a possible 800,000 Indians would die from famine and diseases as well. A truly horrible event, and it is one that often goes unheard in the Western world. Back to Elgin, he faced a period in Singapore where he had to await some troops from India to come over to China, and during this period, he began to study the China situation. Elgin visited an opium den in Singapore to witness the evil effects of the drug firsthand. He wrote to his wife about the experience. "They are wretched, dark places with little lamps. The opium looks like treacle, and the smokers are haggard and stupefied, except at the moment of inhaling, when an unnatural brightness sparkles from their eyes." As a result of dispatching men to India to help Canning, Elgin now had to go to China aboard a single ship, the Shannon, without any troops. He arrived in Hong Kong on July the 2nd of 1857, and he was welcomed warmly by the Chinese. Seymour was not all too pleased to find Elgin arriving without any troops. Seymour soon pressed Elgin to form an attack on Canton, handing to him a petition signed by 85 British opium merchants who all believed if Canton fell to the British, the Emperor would have to capitulate to all of their demands. Elgin did not give in to the pressure, though he also did not have the troops to carry out the task regardless. Elgin then began to brush shoulders with Harry Parkes, and they did not get off on the right foot. Parkes said of Elgin, "He may be a man that suits the government well, very cautious, having ever before him placating Parliament, the world, the public, etc." Well, Parkes soon began a campaign against Elgin by sending a ton of letters back home criticizing Elgin for what he called, quote, "too generous a treatment of the Chinese." As war hawkish as Seymour and Parkes could be, it was Bowring who really brought the heat. Bowring felt demoted by Elgin's new position and began to work behind the scenes to bring Elgin down. Bowring also had begun to lecture Elgin on the imperative for full-scale military action against Canton. "There is quite an explosion of public opinion as to the fatal mistake which would be committed by any movement upon Peking until the Cantonese question is settled. Many think such a movement might imperil the whole trade of China. I am quite of the opinion that any action which refers the Canton question to the Emperor would be a most injurious and embarrassing step." Elgin, for the most part, simply ignored Bowring and opted instead for negotiations as were his instructions. Elgin also shared a concern it seems the other men did not have. Elgin worried about tearing China apart. Elgin did not want to topple the Manchu rulers of China and throw the nation into some balkanization hellscape which would only make things harder for Britain to deal with. The Taiping and their talk of banning private property scared the hell out of Elgin, who knew Britain's trade would be hurt by such rule. In the end, Elgin did not wait for reinforcements from India. He instead went to India himself. Elgin gathered a small force of 400 Marines and sailors aboard the 55-gun ship Shannon and sailed for Calcutta. Elgin made it to Calcutta on June the 14th, where he found the city abandoned by its European residents. Turned out, there was a rumor the sepoys were going to march into the city and slaughter all the Europeans, so they all fled. The rumor proved to be false, however. Elgin was mortified by the situation in India. He was lambasted with horror stories of sexual atrocities committed against British subjects and mass hangings in reprisal. One Major Renaud ordered the execution of 12 Indians for allegedly turning their faces in the wrong way as Renaud's troops marched past them. That same major also allegedly burnt down every Indian village he passed by and hung 42 villagers along the way. Elgin sent a letter back to his wife. I have seldom, from man or woman, since I came to the East, heard a sentence that was reconcilable with the hypothesis that Christianity had come into the world. Detestation, contempt, ferocity, vengeance, whether Chinamen or Indians be the object. Elgin hopped aboard the steamship Ava on September the 20th to return to China. Back in China, Bowring had taken advantage of Elgin's trip by making overtures to Yuming Chen in violation of Britain's instructions that the Chinese viceroy should only deal with Elgin. When Elgin found out and confronted Bowring, Bowring simply denied it. A month after Elgin had arrived to China, his French counterpart also arrived, Baron Gros. The French aristocrat quickly began to share Elgin's hatred for Bowring upon meeting the man. Gros and Elgin both agreed to disagree with Bowring's ideas from the very offset. Gros and Elgin agreed the response to the arsenic bakery debacle and the murder of Father Chapdelaine would be well coordinated, measured, and hopefully light on military deaths. Gros advocated for an attack upon Beijing, while Elgin urged for negotiation. However, Foreign Minister Clarendon chose another option. Clarendon sent Elgin a letter on October the 14th supporting Bowring's ideas. Winter was fast approaching, and the Beihe River, the very gateway to Beijing, would be frozen before an Allied army could reach the city gates. Thus, Clarendon advocated for an attack on Canton. Elgin was forced to allow Bowring to take the lead. In November, William Reed, the new American minister, showed up aboard the 55-gun steamship Minnesota. Reed was instructed by his government that America would remain neutral in the inevitable conflict. Russia's emissary, Yefim Vasilyevich Putyatsin, often referred to in the West as Count Euphymius Putyatsin, also arrived in November aboard the America. Small interesting side note, not too long ago I wrote a script for Kings and Generals about the many attempts at opening up Japan, and this man was the leading Russian envoy trying to do just that, and he was almost successful. Literally, he basically was ready to sign a treaty with Japan to open some trade, but something was going on because of a war at the time, so he had to leave for about a few years or a few months. I can't actually remember the time span. And in that time span, Commodore Matthew Perry showed up and signed the treaty, thus opening Japan to trade with America. Anyways, it was just a small side note. Putyatsin brought with him a proposal for China. If the emperor would give Manchuria to the Russians, the Tsar would help the Qing stamp out the Taiping rebels once and for all. So each four of the nations brought their representatives looking to strike a deal with the Qing dynasty. In December of 1857, 3 ships carrying 2,000 British soldiers from Calcutta sailed into Canton's harbor, followed by a French fleet led by Admiral Rigaud de Genaille. Elgin and Gros sent Yuming Chen separate ultimatums. France demanded the murderers of Father Chapdelaine to be brought to justice, reparations, and permission to operate unrestricted in Canton. Britain demanded compliance with the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing, a permanent British ambassador in Beijing, and unspecified reparation for the loss of life and property. Elgin felt his demands were pretty reasonable, but he also knew full well they were too unacceptable for the emperor. Yuming Chen believed the demands to be mere posturing rather than actual threats. He did not have the authority to satisfy the British and French ultimatums. So, he did nothing. Well, nothing is a strong word. He actually began spending his time by beheading 400 Taiping and placing their heads on spikes atop Canton's walls. It seems perhaps Ye believed such actions would scare off the foreigners, because he had no real army or navy backing him up. Well, his brutality against the Taipings surely backfired. The British enlisted 700 really pissed off Hakka to man the artillery at the Dutch Folly, which was just across the Pearl River near the foreign factories. Hakka, if you remember, made up some of the Taiping ranks, as they were a persecuted ethnic minority in Guangxi province. 8 British and 4 French steamships arrived to the scene to add some extra military might. Yuming Chen replied to the British and French in separate letters. To the British, Ye stated that in 1850, Sir George Bonham had agreed to give up access to Canton to avoid a war with the Qing dynasty. Ye heard that Bonham was given the Order of Bath, and perhaps if Elgin did likewise, he could receive such a title. Ye was not aware that the title of Earl was higher than that of Sir, but you have to give the guy some credit for doing his homework on the titles and customs of a foreign nation. As for the Treaty of Nanjing, Ye simply stated the Emperor declared the terms would be inviolate for 10 millennium. It would be suicide to go against the Emperor. Ye then sent a letter to the French, and while he made these rather coy and cheeky remarks, he did not seem to grasp the real war threat that was going on. It may have been because he was too distracted by the Taiping Rebellion, which, to be brutally honest, was a much more pressing concern. Regardless, Ye lacked any real strategy with how to deal with the foreign threat. When the British and French landed on Hunan Island, just opposite of Canton, on December the 15th, Ye apparently made no move. The British and French disembarked without any resistance and found the strategic island undefended and without any fortification. 200 Chinese war junks and saipans near Hunan Island fled as soon as the British and French had arrived. On December the 21st, Elgen, Gros, and Putyetsin had a talk aboard the French flagship, Audacieuse. They all agreed to give Yuming Chen one more chance before shelling Canton. They sent Ye a 2-day deadline to meet their demands, and as they waited, Elgin wrote in his diary, "Canton, the great city doomed I fear to destruction by the folly of its own rulers and the vanity and levity of ours." While they waited for over 2 days, Elgin and Gros discussed military organization. Admiral Seymour and Rigaud would command the sea forces, while land troops would be commanded by General Ashburnham. On paper, the invaders seemed to be completely outgunned. Canton's 6-mile wall circumference was 25 feet high and 20 feet wide. The Allied force amounted to 800 men of the Indian Royal Sappers and Miners, the British 59th Regiment of Foot, 2,100 Royal Marines, 1,829 men of the British Naval Brigade, and 950 men of the French Navy. The Qing forces were around 30,000 strong at Canton, thus the Europeans would be outnumbered 5-1. The Europeans did have one major tactical advantage, however. The European shipborne artillery had superior range and firepower compared to Canton's guns, and their position on Hunan Island was within shelling distance of Canton. On December the 22nd, Ye's deadline ran out, and Elgin and Gros hesitated. On December the 24th, perhaps because it was so close to Christmas, they decided to give the Viceroy another 3 days to accept their terms, but Ye did not respond. On the evening of the 27th, the Europeans sent a reconnaissance team ashore a mile from the city's walls. On the morning of the 28th, the Anglo-Franco Armada began shelling the city with artillery support from Hunan Island. The bombardment went on for an entire day, and on top of the shells, the Europeans also fired incendiary rockets. It is alleged that Qing defenders only tossed back 2 shells in retaliation. It is estimated the Chinese suffered around 200 casualties to the shelling, while the incendiary rockets lit parts of Canton ablaze. While the day-long shelling was raging on, 500 British and French forces landed and made their way through some rice paddies and came across a cemetery. At this cemetery, Qing soldiers were taking up positions behind tombstones. Many of the Qing soldiers were armed with the 18th century weapon known as the jingal. Now, if you have a chance to Google these, please do, because they are comical to say the least. To give you more of a visual, the jingal is a muzzle-loaded giant musket. The barrel is around 60 inches. Usually these were mounted on walls, but they could also be placed on tripods or on the shoulders of a comrade while you shoot it. So picture a comically big musket. That's basically what it looks like. In the West, we call them wall guns. And they were extremely impractical. So for the Qing, it took a minimum of 2 men to fire one jingal. And usually when they fired them, the kickback knocked the men to the ground, which provided quite a slapstick amount of humor for the Europeans who witnessed it. And that's not just my opinion, a lot of diary entries have a lot of Europeans laughing about these things. Many of the Qing soldiers also fired bow and arrow alongside some firelock muskets. On the other side, the British and French were using 19th century rifles, such as the British Enfield rifle and the French mini rifle. Basically, to be brutally honest, it was like Mike Tyson fighting an infant. The Europeans began to take up positions behind tombstones, similar to the Qing. During the night, the Europeans formed an HQ in a temple on the cemetery grounds and apparently did nothing while some of their soldiers began to ransack the cemetery's statuaries, thinking they would find gems or gold inside them. Dawn of the next day, the Europeans woke up to a shocking sight. On the hills behind Canton emerged 1,500 Qing soldiers. The Qing soldiers had fled the battle to go atop the hill, and they were simply staring at the Europeans like they were watching a sports game. It seems Yi's brutality had caused a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the local populace, and this resulted in quite a lackluster will to fight. At 9 a.m., Admiral Rigaud personally led French troops towards the walls of Canton, carrying scaling ladders. The defenders on top of the walls provided little resistance, while some Chinese artillery on some nearby hills tried to shell the invaders. By 10 a.m., the British and French flags were flying from the 5-story pagoda near the walls. Alongside the wall climbing, the British stormed the east gate of the city with ease. Over 4,700 British, Indian, alongside 950 French troops scaled the walls in total. Simon Rigaud had stopped the shelling to allow the troops to get atop the walls and began to fire again. But Elgin quickly forced them to stop, deeming it to be overkill. The death toll was incredibly lopsided. The French reported 3 men dead and 30 wounded. The British reported 13 men dead with around 83 wounded, and the Qing suffered up to a possible 650 casualties. The Allies quickly set to work hunting down Yuming Chen, who they believed was still hiding within the city. Yi's second-in-command, Bi Kui, came out suddenly, making a proclamation that he would no longer associate himself with Yuming Chen, nor his disastrous policies. On New Year's Day, Elgen made a tour of Canton and noticed a lack of resistance, confirming to himself he had made the right decision to halt shelling the city. Then Elgin witnessed large-scale looting. Elgin's private secretary, Lawrence Oliphant, noted, "While Honest Jack was flourishing down the street with a broad grin of triumph on his face, a bowl of goldfish under one arm, and a cage of canary birds under the other, Honest Jean, with a demure countenance and no external display, was conveying his well-lined pockets to the waterside." It seemed the French preferred to grab cash while the British sought out souvenirs. Elgin feared losing control of the men, and he ordered them to all stop looting, but he had no authority over the French forces. Upon seeing that the French were not halting their looting, the British soldiers soon rejoined the plundering spree. Elgin lamented the situation in his diary. "My difficulty has been to prevent the wretched Cantonese from being plundered and bullied. There is a Hindi word called loot, which gives unfortunately a venal character to what would, in common English, be styled robbery. Add to this that there is no flogging in the French army, so that it is impossible to punish men committing this class of offenses." The son of Hao Kwa and the other Kohong merchants began to petition Elgin to do something to restore order and to stop the plunder and destruction of Canton. Within mere days of the city's occupation, 90% of its inhabitants fled the city. One thing Elgin did not seem to mind, though, was official expropriations, and he sent one Colonel Lemon with a few Royal Marines to Canton's treasury, where they seized 52 boxes of silver, 68 boxes of gold ingots, and over $1 million worth in silver taels. This legal plunder, wink wink, was put aboard the HMS Calcutta and sent post-haste to India. After all, the war had to be paid for. On January the 5th, over 8,000 British and French marched through the gates of Canton unopposed. Harry Parkes grabbed a squad of 100 Royal Marines and he rushed over to Yuming Chen's residence, armed with a miniature of the man to identify him. This was quite a smart move, because many of Yuming Chen's subordinates had attempted to pass themselves off as the viceroy to protect him. Well, the tactic provided results, as they did catch Yuming Chen, as he was apparently trying to climb over the rear wall of his residence to escape. A marine seized Ye by his queue in a comical fashion and dragged the man to a sedan chair, enclosing him with bars to humiliate him. The tiny prison was put aboard the steamship Inflexible to an audience of Europeans and many Hakka, including Taiping rebels who taunted the disgraced viceroy by making a slashing throat gesture towards him. When the Marines searched Ye's residence, they came across his letters back to the Qing court, giving them a ton of insight into how the Qing worked. That same day, Elgen and Gros named Ye's second-in-command, Pi Kui, the new governor of Canton, but he would be advised by the triumvirate of Parkes, Captain Matsino, and Colonel Holloway. Thus, the three real powers behind Pi Kui were granted control of judiciary and the ability to vet edicts before they were promulgated. Each man spoke Chinese and would report to Clarendon. Elgin wrote to Clarendon to explain the situation. If Pi Kui was removed or harshly dealt with, we should be called upon to govern a city containing many 100,000 inhabitants, with hardly any means of communicating with the people. The Europeans also created a police force for Canton to stop all the looting and to try and restore confidence in the once great commercial city. Hao Kwa, his son, and the other Kohong merchants found the new situation with the Europeans a far better deal than what would occur if the Taiping took Canton. Pi Kui received some secret instructions from Beijing on January the 27th, ordering him to organize an army of civilians and to kick the invaders out. He also received orders from Seymour to hand over 17 Chinese war junks to help fight off a Taiping fleet obstructing the Pearl River. On the 28th, 2 French warships, the Fusée and Mitraille, both shelled Ye's residence to further Ye's punishment. Ye's subordinates made attempts to rescue him from his prison, so Elgin sent Ye into exile all the way over in Calcutta on February the 20th. In Calcutta, Ye lived under house arrest for over a year until, allegedly, he starved himself to death. Back over in Canton, the 70th Sepoy Regiment arrived in March to reinforce Canton's garrison. The Sepoys were delighted when they found out 200 Chinese servants were assigned to them, as they had been dealing with a lot of racism lately. Notably, the British called them the N-word, and the French killed 3 Sepoys claiming that they were looting. These, of course, are the same French who were looting themselves. Duly note, not a single European was ever shot for looting in Canton. Elgin, Seymour, and Gros took a naval squadron up north towards the mouth of the Baihe River by April the 24th. The British, French, and Russian plenipotentiaries sent a joint communique to the governor of Jili province, Tan. Elgin, ever the pacifist, tried to negotiate a way out of further bloodshed, writing to Tan to see if they could meet a minister duly authorized by Emperor Xianfeng. Tan performed the standard Chinese response, by stalling and claiming he didn't have the power to negotiate with them. Apparently, in his letter response, he used larger characters for the Emperor rather than that of Queen Victoria, which infuriated the British as it was, again, in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing, because both nations were supposed to be considered equal. If you think about it, it is rather ironic. Both the British and the Qing were both so uptight about these status symbols and such. It really was a clash between 2 of the most arrogant civilizations that the world had ever seen. Tan sent another letter that indicated the Chinese position was shifting somewhat. It offered some negotiation, opened some ports, granted religious freedoms to Christians, and agreed to pay reparations for the foreign factories being destroyed in 1856. Tan also said that he passed on the Europeans' request for an embassy in Beijing to the emperor. What he did not tell them was that the emperor rejected that request outright. Putyatsin, in an attempt to avoid further bloodshed, pleaded with the parties to accept this offer but allegedly the French Foreign Office replied to him with a smirk, "They are only Chinese lives." Must have been a Parisian. On a bit of a side note, a rather remarkable thing occurred on the Russian side of this story at this time. The archimandrite, named Palladius, something of a spiritual leader to a tiny population of Russians living in Beijing, was granted permission by Emperor Xianfang to visit the European fleet at the end of May. He was forced to travel in a sealed litter. Prior to leaving, Puyatin got word to the man, ordering him to gather as much intelligence as he could traveling towards them. Palladius was able to peer through a small crack in the shutters, and he did his best to get details on the position of the Qing fleet. When Palladius arrived, he brought with him great news. Apparently Beijing was starving, and the rambunctious life of the emperor was catching up to him. Please note, the emperor was only 30 years old at this time. The guy really must have been partying it up. Another thing the emperor was doing was strongly contemplating leaving the country because he was terrified. Meanwhile, Elgin's anxiety was being lifted day by day as more warships began to arrive. By late May, the combined Anglo-Franco fleet was now 26 gunboats strong, preparing to take on the famous daku forts that guarded the mouth of the Beihe River. D-Day was to be May the 20th, and the invaders were just 100 miles away from Beijing. I would like to take this time to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. If you're listening to this and you like everything Opium War, over on my channel I have an episode for the first Opium War, the Second Opium War, and a historic film review of the 1997 film, The Opium War. A lot of Opium War stuff. Give it a look, it would mean a lot to me. The reluctant Elgen had done it. They seized Canton, and they finally brought Yuming Chen to British justice. The British-Franco coalition was working its way slowly but surely to strangle Beijing and to force its emperor to abide by their demands.